The Adventure of the Forgotten Donatello. Written by Petr Macek, music by Daniel Barták, read by Jamie Marshall. I've always felt better about publishing my accounts of curious robberies and burglaries than those concerning some poor soul's death or even murder. Truth be told, especially in the early days of my literary career, recounting particularly tragic cases made me feel that I was preying on someone else's misfortune. It took Mr. Doyle, with help from Sherlock Holmes, some time to talk me out of it. Even then, I always endeavoured to present as varied an array of cases as possible to those interested in my friend's work, rather than clouding their minds with naught but morbidities. Looking at my selection of cases for this volume so far, I believe it's high time for a change of tone. A case comes to mind in this connection which we encountered during one of our sojourns in sunny Italy. In this context, it's important, first off, to point out that although Holmes and I have visited a great swathe of the world, our travels were never of the short or holiday type. The detective was not one to indulge in the touristic pursuit of the seven wonders of the world, and his idea of respite was limited to the divan by our hearth, a pipe, and a full tobacco pouch. When he did venture outside of London, or even beyond the borders of England, the journey was always strictly expedient. Although he ignored the call of Hermes with icy calm, he could never resist the lure of an interesting crime or mystery. Yet our sojourn in Capri was on other grounds entirely. Following a particularly involved and exhausting investigation, which need not be specified herein, Holmes needed to recuperate both physically and mentally. Our mutual friend, the physician who kept up my practice whenever I was unable to fully attend to it, emphatically recommended that Holmes spend at least 2 weeks somewhere warm with plenty of fresh air, and most importantly, as he stressed, in peace. Holmes would have none of it at first, but as I too felt the need to shake off the recent tension, together we managed to persuade him. 2 weeks of travel beyond England seemed to me not only an excellent idea, but indeed a prerequisite for such a holiday to make any sense at all. For one thing, it was practically impossible to find a place in our homeland where temperatures would exceed 10 degrees at that time of the year, and for another, it was only beyond the country's borders that the detective could hope to find at least some degree of anonymity. The Isle of Capri, situated at the lower end of the Apennine Peninsula, appealed to us not only for its beautiful scenery and diverse flora, but also because there was an exceptional artistic masterpiece on display at the moment, a recently discovered work by the famed Renaissance sculptor Donatello, a bronze nude figure of an antique warrior about 8 inches in height. This is at least what they claimed in the Illustrated London News, which I opened during a delicious breakfast of homemade apple pie and compote, faithfully brought to us by Mrs. Hudson. The illustration next to the article immortalized forever the owner and the finder of the statuette, 2 pompous Italians with beaming smiles. I do take the liberty of correcting the author of the text, however. Holmes called to me from behind the closed door of his bedroom, just as I'd finished reading the article. That statuette was not newly discovered. It has merely been newly attributed to Donatello. Be that as it may, it is a fantastic achievement, and I would rather like to see it before they move it from the private collection where it was found to a depository where it will be studied by scholars, only to be shown to the public again many years hence. As he had not yet left his room that morning, I could not fail to wonder how he could tell, through the wall, what I was doing, which newspaper I was reading, and even which article I just beheld. He had even guessed this unspoken thought of mine. Judging by the vigorous clink with which you put down your teacup, I gather you were wondering how I could possibly know what you were leafing through at this very moment, he laughed, with amusement from a distance. It's elementary. Before retiring to our bedrooms last night, you arranged the newspapers on the table, from the most recent to the oldest, as per your fastidious manner. The Illustrated London News was delivered yesterday afternoon, and I managed to read it in the early evening, whereas you saved it to read at breakfast, which is why you placed it on top. After all our years of cohabitation and the countless instances we've spent together, I know precisely how fast you read. And because I heard you pouring out the tea and rustling the pages you were about to read only a few moments ago, I deduced the exact time when you were likely to reach the end of the article at the bottom of the front page. Am I right? As always, after he'd performed a similar stunt, I had nothing whatsoever to add. That very day, desiring to refresh not only our bodies but also our souls, we purchased train tickets to Naples, and 3 days later we found ourselves aboard the first morning ferry to Capri, a small island in the Bay of Naples, along with a group of noisy and boisterous Italian youths heading to the same destination. Perhaps we were foolish to expect to find the peace needed to rest in Italy, let alone its southern regions. We could only hope that the recommended lodgings are sufficiently secluded, Holmes sighed, as the ferry approached the picturesque harbour of Marina Grande, nestled in a natural bay with high cliffs rising up on either side. Chaos reigned supreme here too, but not because of the Italian temperament. It was because of a crime. The members of the local carabinieri boarded the ferry as soon as it had docked, and after a stormy discussion with the ship's captain, announced to all the passengers that no one would be allowed to disembark. With my limited knowledge of Italian, I had grasped that the island had just been closed off. One of the youths, about whom I'd clearly formed a mistaken opinion, turned out to be a capable interpreter into English, and willingly offered us his assistance. A work of art of incalculable value was stolen here during the night, and the police refused to allow anyone to leave or enter the island until the entire matter has been resolved. He translated the words of the garrulous policeman. They are hoping the culprit has not yet left the island, and they are conducting a thorough search. It was fairly obvious that he was talking about the Donatello statue. "And where is the Navy?" inquired the detective, scanning the horizon doubtfully. He saw nothing in the azure waters around us, because without them, they will have a hard time indeed controlling the movement of private vessels in the surrounding waters. There was another excited exchange of melodic words, accompanied by theatrical gesticulation. There are supposedly patrols with binoculars all along the coast, monitoring the traffic at sea. If they spot a vessel departing without authorization, they will dispatch a motor launch to pursue it, our interpreter informed us. This time, Holmes kept his disdain to himself, and politely, albeit without any room for objections, asked to meet with whomever was in charge of the search. "But what about your holiday?" I grumbled discontentedly, disappointed that we had failed to evade work even here. "Let us be honest with ourselves, Watson," my friend grinned. "My work is my hobby, and cracking a theft like this would be as soothing to my nerves as relaxing baths and massages, possibly even more so." I will not dwell on the chain of lower and, if not in stature then in rank, higher officers we were obliged successfully to muddle through, but before long we were presented to the young, dark-haired commander of the garrison, dressed in an overly embellished dark blue uniform, with piping, red lampasses and highly polished boots. Holmes muttered under his breath that such attire was appropriate at best for conducting an investigation at an amusement park, but outwardly put on a sweet smile. Fortunately, the carabiniere was not lacking in sagacity and linguistic facility, and no interpreter was needed. He also proved to be aware of Holmes's reputation, and quickly understood that the famous detective's involvement in the case significantly increased the chances of a prompt resolution. The detective prodded him further. We are on an island with more than 10,000 inhabitants and countless tourists, scattered over an area of approximately 6 square miles. In such conditions, searching for a small statuette is comparable to looking for a needle in a haystack. The investigation must be conducted with the utmost professionalism. There is only a squad of orderly police permanently stationed on the island, the commander admitted in shame. The detectives and criminal investigators from Naples have yet to arrive. The gallery owner reported the theft only a while ago, and closing off the island seemed to me the best solution. Allow me to offer you my services in the hope that by the time your colleagues arrive, the case will be solved, said Holmes with a slight bow. I shall be happy to leave all the credit to you. The little man's arm shot up in the air as he thanked the gods in his native tongue for sending this aid, and he bade his men to arrange for our transport to the scene of the crime. We set off up a winding road to the higher reaches of the island, whose principal city shared its name. The historic centre of Capri was situated on a sort of plateau overlooking the sea. The island itself, as far as the eye could see, was covered in a carpet of colourful flowers that gave it the moniker Flower Island. If I were a painter, I might not have had a colour palette adequate to capturing everything realistically. We alighted from the carriage with a police officer in front of the Grand Hotel Quisisana in Piazza Umberto I. The square was dominated by a tall clock tower, and the traditional morning market with vegetables, fish, and other fresh food was in full swing, the air permeated with a mixture of distinctive aromas. On the way here, we had gone through all the available information. For generations, the statue had belonged to the private collection of Signore Montesuti's family, one of the oldest on the island, with roots dating back to the 14th century, when the island was first settled. Until recently, the creator of the artwork was uncertain, but a recent expert opinion had attributed it to Donatello. It is a fact that after leaving his native Florence, he had worked in many places across Italy, including Siena, Pisa, Rome, the Vatican, and Naples, where he had carved a remarkable tombstone. During his stay in Naples in the first half of the 15th century, the artist had apparently spent some time in Capri as a guest of Montesuti's ancestors, and clearly did not idle the time away with folded hands. Following the discovery, the family's current patriarch, Alessandro Montesuti, a prominent Italian billionaire and philanthropist, decided to donate the statue to the Museo e Galleria Nazionale di Capodimonte in Naples, but as a patriot of Capri, demanded that it first be put on display for several weeks at a local gallery, where it could be admired by the inhabitants and visitors to the island. The Carabinieri officer provided us with the latest news. The gallery was located on the ground floor of Signore Montesuti's villa, right here on the square, with the rest of the house occupied by his extended family. The gallery, like the entire building and extensive grounds, is under surveillance around the clock. But the thief had overcome the guards. The man patrolling the very hall where the statue was located was found unconscious and handcuffed in the early hours of the morning. The Donatello, of course, had disappeared. Who found the guard? Signora Montesuti, the wife of the master of the house. The elder sister, the policeman specified. Signore Alessandro is a widower, raising only a daughter, Eleanor. His sister Luisa Maria moved in years ago after she herself was also widowed. She has a son, Giacomo, whom Signore Montesuti has practically adopted. As far as I know, the family lives in complete harmony. I would like to speak to them. Who else was in the house last night? Holmes inquired. Beside the servants, only a representative of the museum and an agent of the insurance company. Both institutions were somewhat uneasy when Signore Montesuti clung to his intention of exhibiting the statue here without proper security. They therefore insisted on the constant presence of their people, quite rightly as it turns out. Indeed, replied the detective, allowing himself to be ushered without further delay into the gallery in the white-plastered two-story house built in the Mediterranean style. He was interested in speaking to the assaulted guard first. The distraught man, guarded by a rank-and-file carabiniere, was squatting on a chair near the entrance, a wet rag pressed against his forehead. Over his shoulder, I could peer into the halls filled with private collections, several interconnecting rooms replete with paintings by the old masters and display cases of various objects. In the middle of one of the smaller rooms, on a low stone, stood another slightly taller pedestal of pinkish marble with a polished round surface, now sadly empty. A door, fitted with a lock, led from the gallery to the private quarters of the house. Likewise, there was only one window into these rooms, that being the very room in which we were standing. It was ajar. Apparently, this was how the thief, or thieves, had entered. Holmes's attention was drawn immediately to the pile of shards on the floor under the sill and the hole in the glass pane. The carabiniere had already described it carefully in his notebook. The burglar, probably with a diamond cutter, cut a hole in the glass from the outside and thrust his hand through it and quietly opened the window. He then crept in, probably hiding behind one of the cabinets, and ambushed the watchman as he passed by, knocking him out. How many men were in charge of security? 2. One inside the hall and one with a dog outside on the grounds. And they saw no one? They had no suspicions until the alarm was raised. Not even the dog barked. Let us believe they did not fall asleep, and that it was most likely a very quiet burglar, Holmes said, focusing on the gaping hole in the glass. First, he examined it closely with his hand, and then ran his finger lightly over its sharp inner edge. The cut-out piece of glass has been broken. Perhaps the thief accidentally kicked it as he climbed out. He was in a hurry, carrying the precious statue, and may have wavered slightly with it, the policeman reasoned. Whatever the case, the guard didn't hear the sound of shattering glass, so it must have happened whilst he was unconscious. I'm delighted to hear that you've included logic in your arsenal, the detective complimented him. There are, of course, several possibilities as to why the robber first carefully cut out the pane and then broke it, but I see no reason why this deduction should not be included among the investigative alternatives. Was I the only one who heard doubt in his voice? Was I the only one who heard doubt in his voice? The carabiniere, however, nodded self-importantly and turned to the guard waiting to be questioned. Yet Holmes made no rush towards the latter, remaining instead by the window and studying the frame, the sill, the handle, even opening it wide and leaning out. A narrow walkway of pebbled paving encircled the entire perimeter of the house, bordered by a carefully trimmed lawn. Yes, you can see the footprints outside the window all the way from here. Someone was indeed kneeling and lurking here, he conceded. The grass has since been covered with dew and almost righted itself, so we won't find any more clues. The direction he came from is not clear. Then he looked up and gazed at the windows on the upper floor. I need to know whose windows open onto this side of the garden, he added. The officer who had led us to the spot ordered his man to gather up the occupants of the villa while Holmes questioned the watchman. As he was about to close the window, the detective's eyes noticed something in the grass. He threw his leg nimbly over the sill and swung himself out into the garden. As you can see, there is little difficulty getting in or out of the house swiftly once the window has been opened, he remarked on his exercise as he bent down to the lawn. A small shard of glass glistened in the grass. When my friend presented it to the officer, the latter merely shrugged. There's nothing strange about the shards falling on either side of the window when they shatter. In any case, it does put the lie to the theory that the thief broke the glass during his careless escape. There is no way a single shard from the floor inside could have flown over the windowsill a yard high and fallen out into the garden. What do you make of it? I'm not sure yet. Let's wait, the detective admitted. Now, I would like the family to meet our guard. Let's see what his statement brings. The carabiniere took the role of the interpreter. In my view, however, it was merely a retelling of everything we already knew, although occasionally the detective interrupted the guard's description of events and asked for details. I had not yet seen the spark of understanding in his eyes, which always indicated to me that he was near to finding a solution. What irritated the detective most was that the guard had heard nothing. The night was so quiet that even the cicadas could be heard from outside, the man argued through the mouth of the interpreter. No footsteps, no door opening, no glass breaking. Sometimes even the most trifling details can give us a clue, Holmes pursued patiently, trying to refresh the man's memory, dulled by the monotonous work. Are you sure you heard nothing strange? Breathing? The rustling of clothes? Maybe, but I told your colleagues, the guard hesitated. Just before I lost consciousness, there was something behind me. It was as if someone stepped on a twig. Yes, we have that on record, the officer agreed. We searched the room carefully, and there was no twig, broken or whole. It was cleaned last night, and if the burglar had brought anything in on his boots, he carried it away again. Holmes rubbed his chin. Interesting, he murmured, his eyes darting back to the window. I gathered that he was examining every growing thing in the garden that such a twig might have come from. Ornamental shrubs, cypresses and other trees abounded. In my mind's eye, I could already see us picking our way through the thicket, looking for broken branches in the hope that a piece of clothing or other trace had got caught on them. Gloom was about to befall me, for it would have been a full day's labor. Instead, the detective shook his head and dismissed the matter for now. We shall see, he mused aloud. Anything could have made that sound. He picked up one of the shards from the window, placed it on the floor, and stood on it. The shard cracked beneath his sole. "Could that have been it?" he asked the guard, but the latter shook his head. "It wasn't so sharp a sound, more muffled, like a crack." The detective strode to the door of the house and grabbed the handle. It clicked, but the door did not open. It wasn't the handle or the lock either. The guard swore. Holmes, dissatisfied with yet another failing of his ideas, pursed his lips. "Well then, we are at a standstill for the present," he concluded, turning to the officer. "I shall need to see this man again. Allow him to rest, but do not let him leave just yet. Now, please take me to the Montesuti family." The drawing room on the first floor, where we were already awaited, could be reached either directly from the gallery, which was connected to the house via the door already mentioned and presently locked, and more commonly through the main entrance to the house, up a broad staircase leading from the hall to the upper floor, which besides the drawing room also contained the private quarters. We were escorted to meet the family by a sulky housekeeper, who, far more than by the theft of a precious artifact, was annoyed by the fact that someone had made a mess of her pantry, and she insisted we put on felt slippers because of the freshly polished floor. She had a whole pile of them ready in the hall. There was an understandable air of nervousness in the drawing room. The morning sun painted a picturesque scene outside the French windows leading to the terrace, which offered a breathtaking view of the bay. Yet the azure sea and the green carpets of vegetation in the background vied for our attention with the luxuriously opulent furnishings of the interior and its inhabitants. The faces of the 6 individuals present were gloomy. It was obvious at first glance who the master of the house was. Alessandro Montesuti, whom I already knew from an accurate likeness in the Illustrated London News, embodied dignity itself. With his grizzled temples and thick hair, he was, even at his age, the prototype of the Roman athletes who stood as models for the sculptors of antiquity. His sister, Louisa Maria, had surely had coal-black hair in her youth, and even at her ripe old age, dressed in a simple black widow's dress. She had a fire in her, now sadly dampened by visible woes. Young Eleanor might certainly have been a beautiful girl and quite her father's daughter, had she not had a shy, almost fearful look on her face. Judging by her tan skin, she liked to spend time outdoors. Giacomo, about 17 years old, had a few pounds on him that suited a boy his age, but he gazed at us with a proud and haughty look. The other 2 men present were not members of the family, but guests who had been deployed to guard the treasure in which their respective institutions were eminently interested. A stern insurance agent, who introduced himself as Marco Salastro, and the shorter, stouter representative of the Capodimonte Museum, Stefano Rossi. To our relief, everyone's education included a knowledge of English. "A rich reward awaits you if you help to find the statue," the owner said in greeting. "I am certain our museum will join in," added Rossi, in whom I recognized the other man from the newspaper. His round face was beaded with perspiration from the heat and anxiety, and he was constantly playing with his fingers, either because of his frayed nerves or because he didn't know what to do with his hands. "It is an incalculable loss. Mr. Rossi of the Neapolitan Museum was the one who discovered the Donatello," Signor Montesuti confirmed. "We are, of course, at your full disposal. In essence, I would like to discuss the events of last night and anything else that you may have noticed," Holmes accepted the proffered seat and a glass of water. "I am distraught about it myself, but cannot think of anything that might be helpful," Montessuti said. "But surely you cannot speak for all," said the detective. "What about your daughter and nephew? Perhaps they were out for a night's entertainment and noticed something on their return." "My daughter does not go among the local youth, much less at night," objected the master of the house. "I cannot imagine what she could possibly have to say to them. I love this island, but I want something better for her. She has studied in Switzerland, and when she marries, she will most likely live in Rome or Paris. The world will be at her feet," he boasted. "Si, padre," Eleanor squeaked, staring at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Giacomo rolled his eyes. "Uncle has a life plan in place for all of us," he drawled dryly. His mother put her hand on her chest in indignation. "Apologize immediately," she ordered her son. His pout became even more pronounced, but he obediently uttered a few words. Montessuti patted him on the head condescendingly and commented with something about the rashness of youth, which he must be aware of, because without his guidance it would grow like weeds. "Is anything else missing besides the Donatello statue?" Holmes changed the subject. Signore Salestro of the insurance company took it up. "No, only the main exhibit. In our opinion, the thief acted with deliberation and did not bother. Signore Montessuti will forgive me with trifles. Even so, the damage is incalculable." "How much was the work insured for?" The insurance agent whispered the sum in Holmes's ear, and the detective's eyebrows shot up. "A very pretty sum indeed." "That is why we initially protested that the statue be displayed here, but the company's management eventually decided to grant an exception if basic security measures were met." 2 guards. Is that not insufficient? There is virtually no crime on the island. It seemed adequate. "Until you advertise the exhibit in the press around the world, of course," Holmes sighed. "The timing was indeed unfortunate, but in a week the statue should have been safe in the museum vault," admitted a consternated Rossi. "After the battle, everyone is a general." "I'm not here to lecture or criticize you," the detective apologized, "but to attempt to help you. Now, if you will permit, I would like to look over the grounds and the rest of the villa." Holmes and I spent about 2 hours walking about the house, and the detective also concentrated on its acoustics, where a sound was coming from and what intensity. We looked out of the individual windows into the garden. It turned out that the window above the one through which the burglar had entered the villa belonged to the apartment of Signora Luisa Maria, but she said she had been asleep all night and had seen nothing and no one. "A pity, for it is your window that offers the best view of the south garden," the detective said regretfully. "I take valerian drops for sleeping," said the widow, pointing to the bedside table where stood a jar and a bottle of medicine. "With those, not even a gunshot would wake me." "Fortunately, there is no need to test that theory, because no one has died. I have, however, investigated cases where guards have been murdered for a far less precious loot," the detective pointed out. Luisa Maria crossed herself. "You don't say! This thief wasn't out for blood?" We descended from the widow's room into the gardens, measuring the distances and the time it took the guard to traverse the various routes around the large estate. Then we returned to the house to meet its other occupants and observe their behavior. We also spent some time with Stefano Rossi, as Holmes was interested in how his discovery had come about. There had been legends about the existence of such a statue in the area for years, recounted the fidgety historian. So I systematically approached all the major local collectors. You see, several huge fires had ravaged the island over the centuries, destroying many documents and archives. Moreover, the Montesuti family was struck by the plague in the 16th century and nearly died out, leaving no survivors who knew the ancient origins of the collections. How tragic, I remarked. That is why Signore Alessandro is so anxious that his daughter should marry well. For 3 centuries, the family has carried the stigma of consistently preserving the family line. Listening to Rossi, I felt some pity for young Eleanor, whose father was seeking a suitable groom for her. Still, Alessandro Montesuti impressed me. He received us in his study, which was overflowing with antiques. Yet again, he offered us nothing that would advance our search. He explained that his bedroom had windows facing the other garden, and he could therefore neither see nor hear what was happening on the other side. It's a shame my sister took those bloody drops. She had only recently complained that they weren't good for her stomach and that she wouldn't take them again. But Giacomo is a worry sometimes, so she probably wanted to get a good night's sleep. It's good for the nerves. Holmes nodded. I see, he murmured. Well, I suppose you can convene the rest of your family and friends to the parlour. I do believe our investigation is coming to a close. Holmes made himself comfortable in an armchair and lit a pipe. Only when he was certain that he had the attention of everyone present did he genially blow out some smoke and begin speaking. The first thing I would recommend, he said, turning to our faithful guide, the Carabinieri officer, is to open the harbour and end the blockade of the island forthwith. It is time to end the chaos and stop confining the inhabitants. The latter looked surprised. But what if the thief escapes with the statue? The detective shook his head and pronounced a crucial judgment. I think not. I am convinced that the statue is still in this house, he declared. I beg your pardon? I exclaimed in wonder, while the others exchanged equally perplexed glances. Even the carabiniere looked as though he had doubts as to whether bringing Holmes into the case was a good idea. Do you think the thief broke into the house and left the loot here? I would put it differently, said the detective. I believe the villa was never broken into, and that the culprit is one of the occupants, and that the statue has not, in fact, disappeared at all. The expressed allegation had the effect of fireworks being thrown among the members of the household and their guests. A heated, typically Italian discussion broke out, in which everybody started getting angry, shouting, waving their hands, and gradually turning their attention to Holmes, who they accused of being mad. He did not bat an eyelid, however, and continued puffing on his pipe, calmly, while watching the spectacle he had unleashed with the amusement of a circus spectator. What an insult to my familia, Montesuti hissed. How did such insolence ever occur to you? Thanks to the evidence, the detective assured him. What evidence? Let us take it one step at a time. Might I know who holds keys to the door which connects the house with the gallery? Only I, frowned the Don. I confiscated all the others because the insurance people and the museum demanded it. They are kept in my study. Very well. Holmes again bade those present to be quiet. The noise level obediently dropped to a level at which his voice could assert itself, allowing the detective to present the demanded chain of his deductions and observations. Even at first glance, there was something odd about the cut-out pane of glass and the pile of shards beneath the window. Indeed, it may have happened, but still, a closer examination of the cut in the window set off an alarm in my head. When cutting glass, the angle of the cut will never be horizontal, but beveled, depending on the height you are cutting the glass from. The angle here clearly indicates that the glass is being cut from the inside, where the floor is significantly higher compared to the ground outside. In order to achieve the same angle from the outside, the perpetrator would have had a stepladder, which was impossible given the frequent rounds by the watchman. "What about the glass under the window?" I asked, trying to follow his train of thought. "My guess is that the perpetrator simply dropped it in his haste and it shattered," the detective surmised. But not until the guard was unconscious in any case. The sequence of events was as follows. The burglar entered the gallery from the house via the connecting door to which he had procured the keys. It could have been anyone who knew where Signor Alessandro had left them in his study. He probably unlocked the door earlier in the day to avoid the sound of the lock turning in the night. It would have been no problem for any of the occupants of the house. He slipped in, wearing a pair of those omnipresent slippers, so his footsteps wouldn't be heard, stunned the security guard, and staged the scene to look like a break-in from the outside, while the other guard was on the far side of the estate. But it didn't go quite according to plan. When the glass fell from his nervous hands onto the gravel walkway, the opposite side from where he needed it, he had to sneak back into the closet for a broom and dustpan and swing outside, where he quickly collected the shards. Except for that one piece that bounced away into the grass and couldn't be seen, and dumped them inside. However, he failed to replace the equipment quite exactly as it had been, which angered the maid that morning. He wasn't a professional, but was merely pretending to be one. Montesuti did not seem convinced. "I am no criminal expert, so I cannot judge the relevance of such a story," he said, looking questioningly at the insurance agent. The latter nodded silently, indicating that it did have some logic. If we were to accept the thesis that the perpetrator came from inside the house, it narrows down the number of suspects to those having this debate. In such cases, motive tends to be the detective's springboard, but any one of you could have had one. This little group has many secrets. Holmes swept a knowing glance over the assembly. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I know everything that goes on in the family," frowned Signore Alessandro. "I shall be glad to reveal certain things to you, but I warn you beforehand you may not like it." "Do tell. What motive would my daughter have, for instance?" He waved a dismissive hand towards Eleanor. "She has everything. She will inherit all my property. I deny her nothing." "There is something after all. Miss Eleanor is secretly married to someone of whom you disapprove, and as she cannot hope for a dowry, surely some other provision would suit her to begin a new life." Eleanor gasped and looked about to faint. Montesuti seemed ready to suffer another stroke. "What?" he cried. "I know I'm putting you in a precarious position, but the truth would have come out soon enough anyway." Holmes apologized to the bleary-eyed girl. You have the deepest respect for your father, yet you cannot evade love. Every now and then you gaze dreamily at the ring finger of your left hand, where a strip of pale skin stands out against the tan. When your father can't see it, you weigh a wedding ring which you take off in his presence. "Is it true?" the master of the house inquired angrily. Something inside Eleanor gave way. "Yes, it's true. I've been married to Matteo from the harbour for several months. I'm sorry if I've disappointed you, father, but I cannot help it." Alessandro rubbed the bridge of his nose in agitation. "My daughter has married a fisherman," he wailed, "a man without a single penny." "But your sister and her son could also have a motive," continued the detective mercilessly. Giacomo rose from his seat in annoyance. "Enough! I will not suffer such disgrace." Holmes was never impressed by shouting and threats. "Surely you will not deny that you have a problem with your uncle. It oozes from your every pore. Although your mother is older than he, Signore Alessandro is the head of the family who makes the decisions. You disagreed with his donating the statue to the museum, did you not?" Luisa Maria bowed her head, and even Giacomo finally gave vent to his hidden defiance. "That statue is not just my uncle's to give away. It is the property of the whole family. He had no right to do it." Montesuti, mentally exhausted by the unexpected rebellion of both daughter and nephew, sat down in frustration. "But I am raising you as my own boy. I don't want to be another piece on your chessboard and accept your charity. I just want what my mother is entitled to as the eldest child," Giacomo exclaimed. Holmes gave the family no respite and continued with the onslaught of accusations. "As for Signora Luisa Maria, I am certain she lied about having been asleep. She withheld the fact that she had seen someone in the garden after being awakened by the tinkling of the glass on the pebbles. I attribute this to an understandable maternal desire to protect her son, whom she herself suspects." "But I am innocent," Giacomo exclaimed in anguish. "Do you truly believe that, mother?" Signora Montesuti hid her face in her trembling hands. It's true, I wasn't asleep. Someone disturbed me. And I looked out and I saw someone who reminded me of you. I'm not sure," she sobbed. "I swear on my honor," the lad insisted. "I am not saying that you are indeed the culprit," Holmes interrupted. "At least for the present. The silhouette your mother saw could have easily belonged to Mr. Rossi, who has a similarly distinctive figure." Holmes turned his attention to the next object of his investigation. The corpulent art historian was again tugging at his fingers in exasperation. "I wonder what motive you have invented for me," he laughed unconvincingly. "It might seem that you would be least interested in stealing a work of art that was destined to be in your custody, would it not?" Holmes chewed his pipe thoughtfully. "The Donatello was to be entirely at your disposal. Its very discovery secured you a place on the front pages of the newspapers and notoriety in curatorial circles which you had only to capitalize on with further study. If you had stolen the statue, you would never have been able to show it to anyone, and all these advantages would be lost to you." Rossi was relieved. "There you are. Of course, then there is the vanity and the collector's obsession." Holmes developed the idea further. "The desire to own something so precious, you would be neither the first nor the last." "That is utterly ridiculous," Celestro interjected. "Perhaps, but not improbable," Holmes said, redirecting his attention. as the insurance agent seemed to be asking for it outright. "As for you, my dear fellow, you are indeed a prime candidate for the crime, as regards the expertise needed to pull it off. Handling the diamond cutter required to cut the glass? Only a professional would think of that. And I am well aware that the best insurance company employees are former criminal investigators. May I ask you if you've ever worked for the police in the past?" "Yes, I have, as you can readily ascertain," he admitted. "But that proves nothing." "No, indeed. Only that you were best equipped to do it. You were also the most accurately familiar with the movements of the guards, and therefore knew how and when to avoid them. To procure Signor Montesuti's keys and slip into the gallery through the passage from the house and arrange everything there to look like an intrusion from the outside would have been a mere trifle for you. Nevertheless, we must not forget the master of the house. Alessandro Montesuti, who, collapsed in his chair, was listening to Holmes's explanation and discussion of possible motives with an expression of increasing torment, only raised his eyebrows. "Insurance fraud," he assured himself, as though knowing already what the detective was about to accuse him of. "It is one of the most classic motives. If the warrior statue is not found, you shall collect a very large check, which you admitted to yourself." The detective nodded. The head of the family raised no protest. The entire miserable group now sat before Holmes like a pack of whipped dogs, their Italian temperament seemingly having been replaced by French phlegmatism. Yet it was a mere pretense. All of them were undoubtedly suppressing a good deal of tension. The air was completely filled with the smoke and the scent of the detective's pipe. The carabinieri could make no sense of it at all. "I don't understand. Who do you blame, then?" he asked Holmes, puzzled. The detective made no reply, but asked the man at the drawing-room door to fetch the night watchman, who had been waiting dutifully in the house ever since his interrogation. "I will answer your question in a few moments," he announced to those present. "I need only to ascertain one more thing." By the time the guard arrived, the detective had prepared a chair for him and set up a small table behind it. He then seated the surprised man in the chair facing the audience, and on the table behind the watchman's back, he laid out a variety of items he'd pulled from his pockets. Our only witness saw nothing, but he did hear something, Holmes pointed out. If we can correctly identify the sound, it will give us a clue to the culprit. I watched the faces of all, but I saw no fear of exposure in any of them. Let us first listen to the sound which occurred to the watchman as most fitting in comparison, said the detective, lifting from the table several twigs of varying thickness from the bushes in the garden. The perpetrator could have brought a similar one in on his clothes, and then stepped on it. Let's compare their sounds. He broke each twig in turn behind the guard's back and waited to see if he would react to their snapping. However, the man shook his head in response to all the attempts. Just as I thought, Holmes acknowledged with satisfaction. I had time to browse the garden and found no sign of anyone trampling through it. This only further confirms my theory that no one actually came from there. Next, he picked up a revolver and an encased knife. I am also taking into account the items the criminal might have had on his person at the time. Naturally, the thief might have brought something to defend himself with, and when the watchman approached, he might have readied his weapon before striking him, Holmes continued. First, he pulled back the hammer of the unloaded revolver, which clicked with no reaction from the guard, and the same result was observed when he opened the snap on the knife's case. What else, then, could be heard in the silence of the night? Holmes' sly grin suggested that he already knew. The longer I thought about the sound, the clearer it became that it was probably a sound made unintentionally, by accident. After all, the culprit didn't want to give himself away. "I beg you, do not keep us in suspense any longer," Montisuti explained. The detective was not to be provoked and continued to present the facts at his own pace. The floor had been freshly swept in the evening, and there was nothing on it but the shards of glass. But I have already ruled those out. Something on the perpetrator's body must have made that sound. Holmes walked slowly around the watchman and stood behind his back again. Or it was the body itself, he declared suddenly. At the words, he interlaced the fingers of both his hands before our eyes, his arms outstretched and his palms rotated at 90 degrees. There was a demonstrative crunch of knuckles. The guard snapped to and cried out as he recognized the sound. It is a habit that the originator is no longer even aware of doing, or of the sound he makes, smiled the detective triumphantly, as he, like the 5 suspects gathered around us, turned to the remaining one. The perspiring Mr. Rossi's hands, which had been drumming away incessantly through Holmes's little performance, as they had since the morning when we first met, emitted another incriminating crunch. His mouth, conversely, could do no more than stammer. "Looking at your hands, it is evident that you suffered from this tic since a young age, and you cannot help it or control it. I assume that is why you dropped the piece of glass. People who crack their knuckles too often soon find them to be visibly swollen," the detective confronted Rossi. "Before you struck the guard, you automatically cracked your knuckles without realizing it." Rossi was still striving to mumble something in his rising panic, but Holmes had no need for his confession. "If you will allow me, I dare say I know why you stole the statue," he said. "The statuette, which you have so famously identified and which has allowed you to boast of an historic achievement, is not Donatello's work at all. I don't know whether you discovered your mistake at the outset or whether you only found it out later, but such an admission or revelation would turn the hero you now believe yourself to be into an amateur and a fraud. You couldn't afford to lose your reputation, which is why you needed the statue to disappear before it was moved to the museum, where it was to be subjected to a detailed examination. Judging by the bluish hue of the historian's skin, Holmes was not far from the truth. Eleanor shrieked. Giacomo snorted derisively, perhaps relieved at the embarrassment that was to be shared with his uncle, and Montisuti rose menacingly before Rossi. On the whole, however, the family, whose professed harmony had taken a turn for the worse in the last few moments, seemed to have united against a common adversary. The carabinieri officer and I proceeded forthwith to Rossi's room and began a thorough search, gradually revealing a set of black clothing, gloves, and a glass cutter. I had the good fortune to be the finder of the last incriminating piece of evidence when I reached under the bed. It was only in the far corner that my fingertips finally fell upon the cool bronze surface of the sought-after object, hastily wrapped in something or other. Naturally, the statue never did make it to the museum, and instead fell into oblivion again. The rest of our stay was, to Holmes's considerable displeasure, spent at a guest house in complete peace and seclusion. Unfortunately, he received no reward.